Nancy Guthrie's neighbors tell NBC News investigators returned this week asking them about any potential internet issues the night of Nancy's disappearance. The homeowners say the agents told them several neighbors mentioned glitches with their internet that night. One of those neighbors tells us when they checked on their Ring cameras, this one here, the one closest to Nancy's property, said not available during the overnight hours of the abduction.
Here in their backyard, you can actually see Nancy's home. It's that brick house there. Experts tell us it would likely take a professional-grade Wi-Fi jammer to knock out internet all the way to the back of this property.
Here's the jammer.
On the night of January 31st, 2026, an 84-year-old woman returned home after spending the evening with her family. The home sat in the quiet Catalina foothills area of Tucson, a place known for its wide properties, dark desert skis, and neighborhoods where homes are often separated by large stretches of land. For Nancy Guthrie, the evening had been ordinary. She had dinner with family members, said her goodbyes, and was dropped off at her house at approximately 9:45 p.m. Nothing about the night suggested that anything unusual was about to happen. But by the following morning, Nancy was gone. Nancy Guthrie was not someone who disappeared without explanation. At 84 years old, she lived a life built on routine. Friends and family knew where she usually was and when. She stayed in regular contact with the people close to her, and sudden silence was unusual enough to raise immediate concern. That concern began the next morning when Nancy failed to appear for a scheduled online church service she regularly watched with a friend. When calls went unanswered, family members decided to check on her. Inside the house, investigators would later say something felt wrong almost immediately. Nancy's phone was still inside the home. Her keys were there. Her daily medication had not been taken. Personal belongings that someone would normally carry when leaving the house were untouched. But Nancy herself was nowhere to be found. Authorities were contacted, and deputies from the Pima County Sheriff's Department arrived to conduct a welfare check. What they discovered quickly shifted the situation from a missing person concern to something far more serious. Outside the home, investigators located blood on the porch. The amount and location of the blood immediately raised alarm among responding deputies. Samples were collected and later tested. According to investigators, the DNA matched Nancy Guthrie. With the victim missing, her belongings left behind, and blood discovered outside the home, authorities concluded that Nancy had likely been taken against her will sometime during the night. Detectives began reconstructing a timeline. Surveillance equipment at the home provided the first clues. A doorbell camera had been active during the evening but suddenly disconnected at 1:47. Investigators believe that was the moment when someone tampered with the device. Roughly 40 minutes later, another piece of technology connected to Nancy also stopped communicating. The mobile application linked to her pacemaker stopped transmitting data shortly after 2:28 a.m. Between those two moments, just over 40 minutes apart, investigators believe Nancy Guthrie disappeared. What happened during that window remains one of the most critical unanswered questions in the case. By the afternoon of February 1st, authorities had officially opened a missing person investigation. Within days, the case would expand into a large-scale search effort involving local law enforcement and federal authorities. For Nancy's family, the shock was immediate. An evening that began with dinner and goodbyes had turned into a mystery with no clear explanation. And as investigators began searching for answers, one reality became clear. This was no ordinary disappearance. The question now facing law enforcement was simple, but deeply urgent. Where was Nancy Guthrie? And who had taken her from her home in the middle of the night? By the afternoon of February 1st, what started as a welfare check had escalated into a full investigation. Detectives from the Pima County Sheriff's Department secured Nancy Guthrie's home and began documenting the scene. The initial facts were troubling. An 84-year-old woman was missing. Her personal belongings remained inside the house. Blood had been discovered outside the residence and later confirmed through testing to belong to Nancy. Investigators quickly ruled out the possibility that she had simply left on her own. Because the circumstances suggested she had been taken against her will, the case was treated as a potential kidnapping. Within hours, additional resources were requested. Search teams began combing the surrounding desert areas of Tucson, focusing first on the neighborhood around Nancy's home in the Catalina foothills. Deputies went door to door speaking with residents, asking whether anyone had seen unusual activity during the night. Search and rescue teams were deployed to nearby desert terrain. The region surrounding the Catalina foothills is rugged and sparsely lit, with large properties and natural desert landscapes that can make nighttime visibility extremely limited. Investigators knew that if Nancy had been taken from the home, there was a possibility she could have been transported through these areas without being easily noticed. K-9 units were also brought in to track any possible scent from the property. Handlers worked with trained dogs in an attempt to follow a trail away from the home, though the results of those early searches were not publicly detailed by investigators. As the search expanded, federal authorities joined the case. The Federal Bureau of Investigation opened its own investigation and began coordinating with local law enforcement. According to statements released during the early days of the case, the FBI provided additional investigative resources, including analysts, technical specialists, and agents experienced in kidnapping investigations. A joint command structure was established to coordinate the growing number of leads and search efforts. Public attention quickly followed. Local media in Tucson began reporting on the disappearance, and within days the story reached national news outlets. The case attracted significant interest not only because of the unusual circumstances surrounding Nancy's disappearance, but also because investigators had already indicated that foul play was likely involved. As coverage expanded, authorities began asking the public for help. Investigators encouraged anyone in the surrounding area to review home security cameras or doorbell footage from the night of January 31st into the early morning hours of February 1st. Even small details, a vehicle passing by, unfamiliar activity on the street, or any unusual movement in the neighborhood, could help detectives reconstruct what happened during the critical overnight window. Tip lines were established to handle information coming in from the public. Detectives also began reviewing surveillance footage from nearby roads and businesses, hopping to identify any vehicles or individuals moving through the area around the time Nancy disappeared. At the same time, forensic specialists continued processing evidence from the scene itself. Items recovered from inside and outside the home were carefully documented and sent for analysis. Investigators were looking for anything that could point to who had been there that night. For Nancy's family, the waiting had already begun. Each passing hour without answers deepened the uncertainty surrounding what had happened inside that quiet home in the Catalina foothills. Authorities were now working under a difficult reality known to every investigator involved in missing person cases. The first days are often the most critical. And as the investigation moved into its next phase, detectives were racing to uncover evidence that could explain how an 84-year-old woman had vanished from her own home and where she might have been taken. In the days ahead, the search for Nancy Guthrie would grow even larger, drawing in federal resources, advanced technology, and thousands of tips from the public. But despite the growing scale of the investigation, the central mystery remained unchanged. Nancy Guthrie was still missing. As the investigation moved forward, detectives focused on one critical objective: reconstructing exactly what happened during the night Nancy Guthrie disappeared. Investigators from the Pima County Sheriff's Department began analyzing digital evidence from the home, including security cameras and electronic devices. These systems often provide the most reliable timestamps when trying to understand how a crime unfolded. One of the most important pieces of technology at the residence was a doorbell security camera. According to investigators, the camera had been functioning normally earlier in the evening. However, at 1:47 a.m., the system suddenly stopped transmitting. Detectives believe the camera was either tampered with or disabled at that moment. The sudden disconnection immediately stood out to investigators. In many cases involving home surveillance systems, cameras only stop working when power is interrupted, internet service fails, or someone physically interferes with the device. Because of the timing, detectives began treating that moment, 1:47 a.m., as a key point in the timeline. But the doorbell camera was not the only technology that recorded unusual activity. Nancy Guthrie had a medical device implanted to help regulate her heart. The device communicated with a mobile application connected to her phone. That application normally records information from the pacemaker and transmits periodic updates. Investigators later confirmed that the app stopped communicating at approximately 2:28 a.m. The two timestamps created a narrow window of time. From 1:47 a.m. when the doorbell camera disconnected to 2:28 a.m. when the pacemaker application stopped transmitting, roughly 41 minutes passed. Detectives believe that whatever happened to Nancy Guthrie likely occurred during this period. This 41-minute window became one of the most closely examined segments of the investigation. If someone had entered the property, disabled the camera, and removed Nancy from the home, it likely happened within that short time frame. Investigators began working to determine whether any nearby cameras, traffic systems, or private surveillance footage might have captured activity during those minutes. Teams reviewed recordings from surrounding homes, nearby roads, and businesses in the wider Tucson area. Detectives were especially interested in identifying vehicles traveling through the neighborhood during the early morning hours. Meanwhile, forensic investigators continued examining the scene itself. Blood recovered from the porch was tested and later confirmed to belong to Nancy Guthrie. The discovery reinforced investigators' belief that she had not left voluntarily and that some form of struggle or injury may have occurred outside the home. Every piece of physical evidence collected from the property was documented and sent for analysis. Detectives were searching for fingerprints, DNA, fibers, or any other trace that could indicate who had been present that night. While investigators worked through the evidence, the case continued to attract public attention. News coverage expanded as the unusual circumstances surrounding Nancy's disappearance became more widely known. Authorities encouraged residents to remain alert and report anything suspicious that might have occurred during the overnight hours of January 31st. Even the smallest detail could help clarify what happened during the narrow window when Nancy Guthrie vanished. But as detectives continued assembling the timeline, one reality remained clear. They now had a window of 41 minutes when something had gone wrong. What they still did not know was exactly what happened inside that window, or who was responsible for it. As investigators worked to understand what happened during the early morning hours of February 1st, the focus shifted toward physical evidence that might reveal who had been at Nancy Guthrie's home that night.
Sheriff Chris Nanos, I know you're giving us limited time, and I appreciate it, with this investigation so fluid. But I want to go back a little bit early on. You said your gut told you that Nancy was taken from her home and that she is still alive at that time. What does your gut tell you now about the entry to the home? And was there forced entry? Or did she know the person that took her? What do you think now?
Okay, so I'm not going to get into the entry of the home or forced entry or any of that. What I'll tell you is I believe, just as I had initially, that Nancy was removed from that home against her will. She was kidnapped, and we still believe that.
How do you piece together the 40 minutes inside that home, after the doorbell camera disconnected? I mean, really, no idea still?
There's all kinds of thinking on that and theories. And to be honest, you don't want the sheriff's theories. Yeah. You want the investigators, because they're the ones who actually physically know the evidence, what they've collected, gathered, that crime scene. They were there. They're doing all the interviews. I have a team of young men and women who do this every day. I hear the pundits that, the crime scene should have been done, should have been held longer. Look, this team of mine has done this type of investigation, homicides, for example, for decades. They have one of the highest solvency clearance rates in the country. Sometimes they get that case that you think will never be solved done in a day. They're very good. They're very well trained. They know what they're doing. I don't go and tell them, okay, we've been here long enough, let's go home. They spent over 20 hours at that scene processing it. They, along with forensic techs who are trained, process these scenes. Then they decide that they're done. They came here with all of their evidence. Some of the evidence we gave to the FBI. Why did we do that? Well, because we know the FBI is good with certain pieces of evidence, that they have the technological skills to deal with things like cameras and phones and different things. And we handed that to them. Ransom notes, gave them to the FBI. We use a lab that we've used again for decades for DNA. We submitted all of our biological evidence to that lab.
And you stand by that lab. I mean, was there any pushback by the FBI on that decision?
No, absolutely not. No, in fact, that's the point is FBI.
Crime scene technicians carefully processed the property, documenting every area where potential evidence could exist. The goal was to determine whether someone had entered the home, moved through the property, and left behind traces that could identify them. The blood discovered outside the house had already confirmed that something serious had occurred, but investigators needed more than confirmation that Nancy had been injured. They needed evidence that could lead them to the person responsible. One area of focus was DNA. According to investigators, forensic teams recovered genetic material from multiple locations connected to the scene. Some of the samples came from areas inside the house, while others were collected from objects found during the broader search of the surrounding area. Each piece of evidence was carefully preserved and sent for laboratory analysis. The process of testing DNA can take time, but it can also provide some of the most important breakthroughs in criminal investigations. Authorities also continued searching the terrain around the neighborhood in the Catalina foothills region of Tucson. During one of these searches, investigators located a glove in a field roughly 2 miles away from Nancy Guthrie's residence. Because the item was discovered within the wider search area, detectives treated it as potential evidence. The glove was collected and sent for forensic examination. Investigators wanted to determine whether the item contained DNA that might be connected to the disappearance. While laboratory work continued, detectives followed another important lead: surveillance footage. Authorities had already determined that the doorbell camera at Nancy's home stopped transmitting at 1:47. Investigators now began looking for any other cameras that might have captured activity before or after that moment. In modern investigations, even areas without streetlights or public cameras can still contain hidden sources of footage. Private security systems, traffic cameras, and business surveillance can sometimes capture vehicles or individuals moving through an area. Detectives began reviewing video recordings from nearby homes and surrounding roads, looking for any sign of movement during the early morning hours. At the same time, tip lines established by law enforcement began receiving a growing number of calls from the public. People reported possible sightings, unusual vehicles, and other observations they believed might be connected to the case. Each tip had to be documented and evaluated. Investigators worked through the information one lead at a time, attempting to determine which details were relevant and which were not. As the investigation expanded, the Federal Bureau of Investigation continued assisting local authorities. Federal agents provided technical support, investigative experience in kidnapping cases, and additional resources to help analyze the growing amount of evidence. Despite the expanding effort, the central challenge remained the same. Detectives still did not know who had taken Nancy Guthrie from her home. The evidence being analyzed, DNA samples, surveillance footage, and items recovered from the search area, represented the best chance investigators had to identify a suspect. But as the days passed, the case continued to grow more complex. Authorities were gathering pieces of the puzzle. They just did not yet know how those pieces fit together. As the scope of the investigation grew, the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie attracted federal attention. The Federal Bureau of Investigation formally opened a kidnapping investigation and began coordinating closely with the Pima County Sheriff's Department. The FBI deployed agents and analysts from field offices across the country, creating a multi-agency task force dedicated to locating Nancy. The team included specialists in forensic analysis, crisis management, and digital tracking, all working around the clock to process tips and evidence. A 24-hour command post was established in Tucson to centralize operations. Investigators worked in shifts to ensure that leads were immediately reviewed, evidence was processed quickly, and the search could adapt to new information as it arrived. Technology became a key element in the investigation. Authorities used helicopters equipped with signal detection devices to search for electronic pulses, specifically targeting the Bluetooth signal from Nancy's pacemaker. This signal, if detected, could have provided investigators with real-time location data. At the same time, K-9 units were deployed to attempt scent tracking, and search teams combed the desert terrain surrounding the Catalina foothills. Investigators also reached out to Mexican authorities to account for the possibility that the suspect may have crossed international borders. Despite these efforts, the case remained unresolved. Investigators reviewed thousands of hours of surveillance footage, interviewed neighbors and community members, and followed up on tens of thousands of tips from the public. Each lead was documented and analyzed, but as of this stage, no suspect had been identified. Forensic analysis of evidence collected at the scene continued. DNA recovered from inside the home and from items in the surrounding area was sent to federal laboratories for processing. A glove found approximately 2 miles from Nancy's home became a critical focus for investigators, as any DNA present could provide a potential link to the person responsible. The public was asked to assist in the investigation. Authorities encouraged residents in Tucson and surrounding areas to check security cameras, note unusual activity, and report anything that could be related to the disappearance. Tip lines remained open 24 hours a day. By this point, the scale of the search was unprecedented for the county. Multiple agencies were involved, federal and local resources were combined, and investigators were working under extreme time pressure. Every passing hour increased the urgency, as investigators sought to locate Nancy before critical opportunities to find her diminished. Yet despite the rapid mobilization and technological resources, the investigation faced persistent challenges. Critical questions remained unanswered. How was Nancy removed from her home without being seen? Who was responsible? And where could she be? The combined efforts of federal and local authorities represented the largest mobilization in the area's history. But even with the full weight of these agencies, Nancy Guthrie's location remained unknown, and her case continued to grow more complex with each passing day. As the investigation into Nancy Guthrie's disappearance continued, law enforcement faced a new set of complications: the public dissemination of information. Sheriff Chris Nanos of the Pima County Sheriff's Department held multiple press conferences to update the public on the case. While the goal was to maintain transparency and keep the community informed, each public statement carried the risk of revealing operational details that could affect the investigation. During these briefings, several key facts about the investigation were disclosed. 1. Pacemaker technology. Authorities confirmed that Nancy Guthrie had a pacemaker and that investigators were attempting to track its Bluetooth signal. This detail explained part of the search strategy, but also revealed a specific method being used to locate her. 2. Medication dependence. It was publicly stated that Nancy required daily medication to survive. While this information emphasized her vulnerability and urgency, it also indicated the timeframe investigators were most concerned about, potentially giving a timeline to anyone holding her. 3. Timeline gaps. Press briefings detailed the exact timeline of the disappearance, including the 41-minute window between the doorbell camera going offline and the pacemaker app stopping communication. This transparency helped the public understand the situation, but also highlighted gaps that the suspect may have exploited. 4. DNA evidence. Authorities reported that DNA from items recovered near the home, including a glove, had been submitted to the National Database, CODIS, but produced no matches. This public disclosure confirmed that early forensic leads had not identified a suspect. 5. Search technology. Information about the signal-detecting helicopter was shared publicly, including the conditions under which it could detect Nancy's pacemaker signal. This update explained search methods to the media, but also clarified limitations in the technology. While each disclosure was factually accurate and aimed at keeping the public informed, these announcements created operational challenges. They provided potential insight into investigative strategies and the tools being used, which could be interpreted by the person responsible for Nancy's disappearance. Law enforcement officials emphasized that the investigation was ongoing and that much of the case remained confidential. However, balancing transparency with operational security became a key concern. At the same time, investigators continued to follow thousands of tips, review surveillance footage, and analyze forensic evidence. The FBI maintained its involvement, coordinating with local authorities to pursue leads across state and national lines. Despite these efforts, no arrests had been made, and Nancy Guthrie's location remained unknown. Each disclosure, while necessary for public awareness, highlighted the delicate balance investigators faced in protecting both the victim and the integrity of the investigation. For Nancy's family, these briefings offered some reassurance that authorities were actively working the case, but they also underscored the slow progress and the uncertainty surrounding her safety. By this stage, the combination of federal involvement, forensic investigation, search operations, and public updates represented one of the most extensive and complex responses in Pima County history. Yet Nancy Guthrie had still not been located. More than a month after Nancy Guthrie disappeared, the investigation remains unresolved. Despite the combined efforts of the Pima County Sheriff's Department and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, no suspect has been publicly identified, and Nancy's location is still unknown. Early leads, including DNA evidence from inside the home and items recovered in the surrounding area, have yet to provide a definitive breakthrough. Surveillance footage has offered only partial insight, and tip lines continue to generate new, unverified information daily. Public updates have confirmed that investigators are actively pursuing every available avenue, but the transparency required to keep the public informed has also highlighted the limitations and challenges of the investigation. Each day that passes emphasizes the difficulty of locating a missing person in a case involving a sophisticated and premeditated disappearance. Nancy's family remains in a state of uncertainty, providing rewards and appealing for information while awaiting answers. The broader community and law enforcement continue to monitor the situation closely, understanding that every detail, every tip, and every technological resource could potentially lead to her safe return. The case of Nancy Guthrie underscores the complexities of missing person investigations, especially when they involve vulnerable adults and require coordination across multiple agencies. While the investigation continues, key questions remain unanswered. Who took Nancy? How was the abduction executed? And where is she now? The search for Nancy Guthrie is ongoing. Authorities urge anyone with information, no matter how small it may seem, to contact the FBI tip line at 1-800-CALL-FBI or submit information through tips. FBI.gov. Each lead could be critical in resolving this case and bringing clarity to a family and community awaiting answers. Nancy Guthrie has not been found, but the work to locate her continues, and every day that passes reinforces the need for vigilance, cooperation, and attention to the facts.